Welcome again to Coastal Matters. This is a co-production of the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy in conjunction with Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. My guest today is Tara Riley, who is a shellfish biologist for the town and county of Nantucket. Thanks for coming, Tara.
Thanks for having me.
What exactly do you do?
Well, the town employs me as a shellfish biologist. I've been here since 2009, and my main charge is to help restore the commercial and recreational shell fisheries around Nantucket. When I first came, my job was very broad. It incorporated water quality, a lot of stuff with habitat and the ponds, but now we've been able to hire and expand our department, so now I'm really just focused on shellfish production for Nantucket.
Where's your office?
My office is on Brant Point, so I'm a very lucky person to have a very beautiful view every day.
And you're almost all the way to the lighthouse. The lighthouse is really your neighbor.
Yep, you have to cross the beach to get to the propagation facility.
And this is under the Natural Resources Department, correct?
It is.
How did you come to Nantucket in the first place?
So I started out growing fish out of school. I went to Auburn University for my master's in aquaculture and was farming fish in Alabama. And then I slowly moved up to North Carolina, where I continued to farm fish on a research level. And then I got kind of disenchanted with the university system and decided that I wanted to try something new. So I got on the internet and I found a job in Virginia with a commercial clam farm. And so I moved up to Virginia on the Eastern Shore and worked for this private company for 7 years. And I was in charge of the hatchery there and all of the production associated with the clams and then later oysters on that farm.
How close is Auburn to the coast? I don't think of it as being in a coastal area.
No, when I was at Auburn, I was a little more interested in farming fish, and it was freshwater fish, so it was inland at the time. So I didn't make the conversion to saltwater until I went up to Virginia.
And why Auburn?
At the time when I was in school, Auburn was a great place to learn how to farm fish. It had one of the largest international aquaculture programs in the United States. And so it was kind of the place to be, and I was just really interested and was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go there.
Did you grow up near a coast?
I did not. I grew up in Atlanta, so no one in my family works on the water or anything like that, so it was kind of like a complete opposite path to take.
Now, you came in 2009. Compare what shellfish, the amount of shellfish in the harbors then with what we have now in 2017.
That's an interesting question. When I came in 2009 and 2010 was the rest of that season, I think they harvested around 7,500 bushels of shellfish. And from that point on, it's been variable, the harvest. So it's been up around 25,000, I think, at the most, and then it's dropped down to 20,000, and this year we're down to 2,000 bushels.
Why so much variability?
There's just a lot of variability associated with the harbor and the habitat and the life cycle of the shellfish. A lot of things are changing. I think when I came to Nantucket, things were already in the process of changing, but they were still looking pretty good. And one thing that's kind of hard for people to understand is it takes a while for things to catch up. So I think the water quality was not doing that great when I came, although things still look good. And then slowly over a few years, it started to actually catch up to the numbers that we were seeing and not look as great.
5 years ago, in 2012, there was a shellfish management plan developed. Tell us about that.
So the Shellfish Management Plan incorporated a committee of about 12 people, and it was resource managers and fishermen and some local organizations, and we all sat down and put together a plan specifically for Nantucket, for Nantucket Harbor and Madaket Harbor. And basically it's a guide on how we want to manage our fisheries and kind of the pieces of the puzzle that we need to figure out, and it prioritized research in a way that we need to, what we need to focus on doing and how we need to prioritize our fundraising and where we need to put our efforts. And so this shellfish management plan is still looking for a committee to oversee it, but in the meantime, we've also been working on the matrix for the shellfish management plan. Our department has specifically. And so anytime we have an opportunity to do research or to seek grant money, we consult this plan and look on the matrix and we say, oh, well, this is the next priority. This is what we need to cross off the list. And so that's how our department operates as far as choosing how we're going to spend our year.
When this plan came into being, had there been a plan in place prior to that?
There wasn't a plan in place, and in fact, the shellfish management plan is one of the first ones in the country.
Really?
There's a couple other towns that have tackled it, but it was a little expensive to do, but it was very time-consuming. But I think we ended up with a great document and a great guide, and we're able to use it when we approach other organizations, when we're seeking funds, and show them that, hey, look, we have a plan in place. This is what we're going to do. We aren't just kind of picking research out of the hat. We have a plan, a formal plan, and it's been approved by the state, and it's been approved by the selectmen and adopted, and that's kind of a unique thing that Nantucket has going for them.
You said there's no committee overseeing this right now.
Right.
Does that mean there's literally nobody overseeing this plan?
Our department, in lieu of an implementation committee, is overseeing the plan. And so, like I said, we use it as a guide to choose our research. And then if we have people that come to us, scientists, and they say, hey, what kind of work does Nantucket need done? We have some funds. We want to do some research on Nantucket. We tell them to consult the plan and come up with a project based on that.
Now, you mentioned your department. Who does that consist of?
So the Natural Resources Department is also combined with the Conservation Commission. So our boss is Jeff Carlson. And then we have a shellfish warden, J.C. Johnson, and Caitlin Shaw is our water quality specialist. Leah Cabral is the assistant biologist, and Joanne Dodd is our administrative secretary. So that's the entire department. So it's pretty small, but we also have a strategic plan that we put in place about 3 years ago. And with that strategic plan, we're able to hire hopefully 2 more full-time people this year.
And when do you find out about that? Does that have to go through the town meeting and all that?
It does. It has to go through town meeting, but we've made it through all the other, the Board of Selectmen checks and balances before it goes to town meeting. So they've approved it. We just need to get the town on board for these 2 additional positions.
And does that come up in April of 2017?
It does.
Is there a typical day at your job?
There isn't. Everything's pretty different depending on what's going on. But with this new building, things are becoming a little more routine. So, we start our season in January and we end at the end of November. So kind of our downtime is December, which works out great for Christmas holidays. But there isn't, like in the past with the old hatchery, we had a lot of downtime. We had November till April because it wasn't a climate-controlled facility, so we couldn't do a lot in the winter months. But now that we have a climate-controlled facility, we're on the hook for making that facility work year-round.
I want to get back to the facility in a minute, but when you're not in that building, in your office, where might you be and how much of your work time is spent outside of the office?
When I'm not in the building working with the hatchery, you can find me probably out on the boat. Usually we're doing habitat surveys, trying to figure out where to put the shellfish for stock enhancement. In the past, I helped out with water quality, and we also have a lot of guys that are growing oysters, so I can be found up on the aquaculture leases up in the head of the harbor, assisting them if they need any help with anything. And a lot of times you can find me in town. There's a lot of meetings going on and presentations going on, so we really try to push you know, the education portion of the job out just to make people aware of where the shellfish are and the status of the habitat and the water quality and what they can do to help improve everything.
You've mentioned fundraising once or twice, so part of your job description isn't just being a scientist, it's also being a fundraiser.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, we definitely have to seek grant money every year to do what we do because our program is largely funded by the recreational and commercial shellfish permit sales. So that's kind of the limits to our budget. So, you know, that helps us run our day-to-day operation, but if we want to do extra projects or we need some specialized equipment, we really depend on, you know, outside funding for that.
There are fewer commercial fishermen now than there used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that has a direct impact on what your office can do.
Yeah, it definitely does. The fleet is shrinking for a lot of reasons. There aren't a lot of new entries coming into commercial fishing because I think that there are a lot of jobs on land that are easier and maybe a lot more lucrative. And so, yeah, the fishery is definitely changing. There are a few young people that are involved in it that, you know, don't have anything to compare it to, so they're kind of enjoying themselves out there. But, you know, it's our hopes to kind of introduce it, kind of reintroduce it to the community and see if we can get some new entries in so that they can learn about the fishery as hopefully it improves over time and that it will become, you know, a successful, sustainable fishery again.
How much of a difference has there been in the number of licenses over the years?
Well, I'd say they probably sell around 150 commercial licenses a year. And the first couple months are the most popular months to fish because the weather's good and that's usually when the scallops are a little bit easier to find and more plentiful. So you see around 50 or 60 boats going those first 2 months, and then after Christmas kind of dwindles down to kind of the hardcore fishermen that, you know, are out there and, you know, really spending their day looking for the scallops and putting a lot of effort into harvesting them.
And you can't have more than 2 license holders per boat, is that correct?
That's right. You can only have 2 license holders per boat. You're only allowed 5 bushels per license.
Can there be a non-license holder also on the boat?
Yep, you can. You can have a color on boat or an observer.
Let's talk about the Brant Point facility.
Okay.
First of all, who owns the building?
So the town owns the building.
Have they always owned it?
They haven't. It was owned by the Coast Guard and moved there. It's debatable when exactly it was moved there. You know, the earliest records we have are from the early 1900s. But it was owned by the Coast Guard and used to bring the boats into the building for them to work on. It had some tracks that came up the dock, and they would roll the boats into the house to work on it. And then over the years, I'm not really sure the exact time that the town acquired it, but it was pretty recently that we actually received the deed of sale on the actual building, but the land is still owned by the Coast Guard.
So the town leases the land from the Coast Guard?
Correct.
And the building is on pilings?
It is on pilings, so there's some flooding that occurs occasionally, so that, you know, is kind of an essential part of the building to keep it out of the water.
Was it on pilings when the town acquired it?
I don't think so. I'm not exactly sure where it was.
You know, it's so high up, I can't see it ever flooding, even in a really bad hurricane.
Yeah.
What goes on there? I know if you take the ferry in at night and look over there, you see some oddly colored lights.
Yeah.
Please explain them.
Well, there's a lot that goes on there. I think people would be really surprised because the building itself looks like a historical boathouse, but once you go inside, it's really kind of a modern wet lab or a hatchery. And so the things that you see inside are, you know, large tanks full of salt water with lots of filters and pumps. And then we have our algae system, which is always kind of great for visual effect. We grow all our phytoplankton that it takes to feed the shellfish. And those grow with air and LED lighting So we use a lot of red and blue LED lights to maximize the growth production of the algae.
In other words,
So-
different colors bring about different growing, rates,
Yep,
patterns?
it's really interesting. We have about 6 different species of algae that we grow depending on what we need to feed. And so different species of algae grow well under different wavelengths of light. So some species that we have grow well under red wavelengths and other ones grow well under blue. And it also changes their nutritional composition. So, I mean, it's really pretty fascinating what you can do with LED lighting. And in the past, we used traditional fluorescent lighting, which was really hot. It was really expensive, and we were just wasting a lot of energy, and the algae wasn't necessarily utilizing that wavelength of light. So it was one of the significant upgrades that we were able to make with the renovation of the building.
So those colors are not just random,
No,
and there is a,
there's a purpose for it, for sure. So,
I've been in there, and I guess I didn't really know what to expect, but it's quite impressive what you've got going on in there. Tell us a bit more about the equipment, because some of those tanks are pretty big.
right. So with shellfish, they're typically reproducing during the spring and the summer months. And so having a hatchery that's year-round allows us to bring the shellfish in the wintertime. So say we brought some in January, and we hold them in a special room called the broodstock room. And that room is equipped with an air cooler that keeps the room temperature at 68 degrees consistently. And then it also is tied into a photo period. So it has 16 hours of light and 8 hours of day. So basically that mimics spring and summer sunlight, the hourly daylight. And so that kind of tricks the shellfish into thinking that it's spring and summer. And so while we're keeping them at that consistent temperature and the lighting is consistent, we're feeding them algae too, and that allows their eggs to ripen and mature so that we can spawn them during a time when they're not normally spawning in the harbor. So that allows us to get a boost on our production and start our season very early. So that's kind of exciting because this year it's exciting because we're able to test out our systems and use the shellfish as guinea pigs to make sure everything's working. But we can also hold a certain amount of shellfish within the hatchery, and we can move them out in April when the water warms up a little bit. And so in the past, we were starting in June. So we had a really short window of time to do all of our work. And now we're able to grow our algae early and just have everything ready to go so that we can do our spawns early. And when the scallops are ready to spawn naturally out in the harbor, we can just bring them in and we have plenty of food to feed them. And everything's really efficient now and set up for production.
So when you say you bring them into the building, they're coming exclusively from Nantucket waters?
Yes, we ask fishermen to assist us with finding seed scallops that will be ready to harvest for next season. And, there's fishermen that are out in Mattakit or Tuckanuck and Nantucket Harbor, and they'll bring us groups of shellfish, and we'll label them and keep them separate. We don't really mix Mattakit Harbor scallops with Nantucket Harbor scallops. And we just keep everything separate and label it so that we have an idea of how the scallops are performing based on where they came from.
And they'll come from different parts of Nantucket Harbor or Mattakit Harbor from year to year. They're not always going to be in the same place.
Yeah.
Now, when you take them back to the harbor, where do they go and how do you decide what spot you're going to choose?
So once the scallops are mature, after they're 6 weeks in that broodstock room, we spawn them in the hatchery. So we'll take them and put them on a table and fill them up with water around 75 degrees. And just that increase in temperature triggers them to spawn. So scallops are hermaphrodites, so they release both sperm and eggs from the same animal. So that makes it a little tricky for spawning. So what we do is we take each scallop and put it into its own little separate container filled up with seawater, and then we visually watch them to see what type of gamete they're going to release. So if they release sperm, then we take the shellfish container and we dump the sperm in the sperm bucket. It's really technical. And then we'll take the eggs and dump the eggs in the egg bucket. So then we end up with 2 buckets with 2 different types of gametes, and we manually fertilize the eggs. So we'll take sperm from all the scallops that produce sperm, and then we'll mix it up in the bucket and then add it to all the scallops that produced eggs. And so you get a genetic variation and a mixture in there, and we usually do around 100 scallops every spawn. So we can keep everything varied. And then the cool thing is that you can look at the eggs under the microscope in a couple hours, and you can see them divide. So you can get an idea of what your fertilization rate is, so you know that you were successful with that part of it. And then the eggs then get stocked in tanks in the hatchery, and they stay there for about 10 to 12 days before we release them into the harbor. So really what we're doing with the scallops is larval production. So they're pretty tiny when we release them. They're like the size of a grain of sand.
Huh.
And so it's kind of a unique type of stock enhancement. There aren't a lot of people that do it because they don't have access to a hatchery. But the idea that we put forward is trying to produce as many scallops as possible and put them out in the harbor at a young age and let them, kind of fend for themselves. Because when you're growing shellfish, it's really expensive to feed them. So the idea is to push them out as soon as possible. And they also take up a lot of space. So there's a certain amount of shellfish that we can grow at the facility, but as soon as we can push them out as larvae, that's what we try to do.
You've talked mostly about scallops, but we also have mussels, oysters, etc. down here. Do you have mussel propagation going on?
We don't. We have never done any mussel propagation. We've done quahog propagation, and then we're also into oyster propagation for Leah Cabral's Shellfish Restoration Project, which is actually really cool. That's kind of probably the second largest component of the hatchery. So we are taking wild oysters that we found in the harbor, and we also have taken some aquacultured oysters from one of the growers up there. And so we are conditioning those to spawn, which will actually spawn next week. And those larvae are a little bit different. They have to set on a piece of shell in order to survive. So Leah's been recycling oyster shells from all the restaurants for the past 2 years and holding them at the DPW. And then you take the oyster shells and you put them in your tank, and you put your oyster larvae in the tank and they attach to the shells. And then they start to grow on these oyster shells, and then you take the oyster shells and you put them in the harbor, and you can form an oyster reef that sustains itself.
So no oyster shells, in the case you're talking about, no oysters? Do they have to have that shell?
They do. They have to have something to attach to. So I'm sure you've seen on pilings, there's oysters attached to pilings.
Mm-hmm.
Nantucket Harbor doesn't have a lot of substrate, so there aren't a lot of places for oysters to attach naturally. But with the aquaculture growers up in the harbor, there's a lot of natural oyster production going on up there now. So we're starting to see oysters attached to drainage pipes and pilings and any rocks over near quays. They're really starting to pop up everywhere.
Now, we have a commercial fishery, obviously. We also have a recreational fishery on Nantucket.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what comes out of the harbor, how much greater is a commercial fishery as opposed to the recreational?
It's definitely greater because people are allowed to have 5 bushels a day in the commercial fishery that goes from November 1st to the end of March. And the recreational fishery starts in October, a month before the commercial fishery, and it also goes to the end of March. But really, most people are doing recreational scalloping in October and November, and then it kind of dies off because the weather becomes pretty miserable and the water's cold. So a lot of people don't really do the recreational scalloping then. But it's really kind of hard to quantify what's coming out of the water in a recreational way, just because people are everywhere. You don't know what time they're going out or where they're going, and they're spread out. So we have one shellfish warden, so it's really hard to kind of track that. But we are asking people when they sign up for their shellfish license and pay for it to tell us how many they got the previous year so that we have an idea of what came out of the water.
Talk some more about the importance of eelgrass.
Okay, so when we release the larvae into the water, we're looking for a healthy habitat. Bay scallops enjoy attaching to eelgrass because it keeps them off of the bottom. And on the bottom of the harbor, that's where the predators are, mainly blue crabs, green crabs, sometimes conch, but that keeps them kind of out of the way of those predators when they're really small and vulnerable. And what we're seeing now with the decline of the water quality in the harbor is that it has a shading effect over our existing eelgrass, and it causes the eelgrass to become shorter. And it also is making the eelgrass disappear just due to high nitrogen levels. So it's really kind of difficult to, do the stock enhancement when you don't have the habitat that you need. And so, we're having to be kind of creative on where we want to put these scallops and decide, where they're going to have the best chance of surviving. There's a difference between the eelgrass in Nantucket Harbor right now and the eelgrass in Mattocket Harbor. So Mattocket
Different species?
not a
or
different species,
different
just
amounts?
different amounts in the health of it. And particularly out near Tuckernuck, away from all of the sources of nitrogen, the eelgrass is very healthy there. So, we definitely consider the health of the habitat when we're making our decisions of where we're going to do stock enhancement.
What are the best ways to keep the eelgrass healthy and to keep the overall water quality healthy in the harbors here?
So we're trying to decrease our nitrogen load in the harbor, and the state has set a limit that we need to try to comply with in terms of how much nitrogen is measured in the water. And so with eelgrass, we have to meet that measured nitrogen level that the state has set in order for the eelgrass to grow or to do any eelgrass restoration projects. And so we're looking at things like sewering, decreasing our fertilizer use, changing our fertilizer use. We're repairing the jetties to increase the flow of the water. And we're trying to educate people on products that are good to use on your boat and things that you shouldn't be doing, just kind of like best management practices to help improve the health of the harbor. So if we improve the water quality, the eelgrass has a good chance of coming back. And we have a good chance of being able to engage in some more restoration projects involving eelgrass if we choose to do that.
The fertilizers, for example, is it discouraged or is it actually illegal to use certain fertilizers in certain areas?
We set the date that you're allowed to start fertilizing, and then you have to have a soil test that if you want to use certain types of fertilizer on your test, on your lawn. And so it's controlled as to how much you're supposed to be using, and the landscapers have all taken classes on what is appropriate for applying fertilizer for Nantucket, and we do have enforcement around to do the checks to make sure that people are complying.
How common is that approach in Massachusetts or nationwide? Are we an exception to the rule doing all of this?
Yeah, I think Nantucket is a very progressive community. It's one of the things that I really like about working here, and I feel like people really, really care about the environment, and they want to try to do the best that they can do to make it, a healthy place to live. We're definitely under a lot of pressure because of the tourism here on Nantucket, and what July and August look like here on the island is much different than what it looks like right now. And so it's trying to find a balance and manage that part of the island so that we can still sustain the water quality and the habitat that is so important.
Now, you've been here 8 years in your position.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see eelgrass, water quality, shellfish propagation, all of this in 5 or 10 years, based on what's happening now and what's been happening since you came here?
I think we definitely have our challenges. I think that the town is making some very good decisions and investments in improving these things. And so I feel like, what we're seeing now is kind of rock bottom, and that things are going to start improving with all the changes that are being implemented and made. It's just a matter of, there's still work to be done. We need to change the way that people think about some of the practices that they do in maintaining their lawns, or some of their boating practices that involve cleaning boats or dumping things in the harbor that don't need to be in the harbor. There's
Not emptying your tanks in the harbor,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah. And so it's just kind of educating people and getting them on board so that, they can have a stake in the changes that are taking place too.
Tara Riley, thank you for joining me today. This has been fascinating, and people can get in touch with you through the Natural Resources Department. Is
Correct.
that right?
Yep. Yep. And we offer tours down at the propagation facility for anyone that's interested.
Having done one myself, I would recommend it. It is fascinating what goes on down there. For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for joining us. Please tune in again next time.